Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 15th of November of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kherson direction. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, as a result of clashes on this area, the Ukrainians lost 95 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles and 6 artillery systems. So as you can see, there are a lot of icons, a lot of updates are coming from exactly Kherson direction. So it's very difficult to understand what is going on there, and it is very difficult sometimes to understand what are the main Ukrainian purposes and main Ukrainian goals, and very difficult to understand why the Russians can't do anything with this foothold. To understand the situation, so I want you to understand the situation. I want to understand what kind of difficulties the Russians faced during this clearing operation, and what kind of difficulties the Ukrainians faced during the same period of time. First of all, we need to start everything from the beginning about the situation. And one more time, this is very important. You will understand what the Russians are were trying to make today, just after you understand the global situation about the Krynky frontline. The main area where the Ukrainians keep their forces, and not just keep their forces, but the main area where the Ukrainians load their infantry and marines on boats, is the village by the name of Tyaginki. From this area, the Ukrainians using the local rivers are moving with the very fast boats to the Russian bank of the Dnipro River. And the main entrance to the Russian area is this point. So using this point, the Ukrainians are entering this small river, and then the Ukrainians moving along the river is going to this position. So this is the main Ukrainian bridgehead, this one. This small square is the main Ukrainian, let's say, landing area. And so this is the main connection road. And having this main connection road, the Ukrainians were able months ago to establish their foothold in this area. But the thing is that if we can increase the number of updates, let's say since the beginning of October, from the area where the main clashes start taking place, we see that the main bombardments are taking place exactly along the supply road. This is the supply road. We see the main bombardments, and we see the main bombardments right on the south, right to the south of the main landing area. So what is the main connection with the things that I'm planning to tell you? The Ukrainians currently understand that the main supply road is under very heavy fire, and they understand that in this situation, anyway, sooner or later, they will lose the battle for the Russian bank of Dnipro River. So currently, the main goal and the main thing that Ukrainians can do and want to do is to develop and increase their logistic. And if we take a look at this map at the rivers, we're gonna see that there are not so many places where the Ukrainians can land their infantry. The second area where the Ukrainians can land their infantry is located a little bit to, let's say, the south west from the main landing area, this one. And for example, using the same road from Tyaginka along the Dnipro River, crossing the Dnipro River, and then entering this river, the Ukrainians can continue their landing operation further and to, let's say, to land their infantry in this area as well. So currently, when talking about this configuration of the front line, we can say that Ukrainians do have at least two areas, two logistic hubs that they can use for sending more and more infantry in this direction. But there are two landing places. But when talking about this configuration of the front line, we see that there is just one entrance point, this one. So, and the Russians, the only thing the Russians need is to establish complete fire and visible control over this territory, and basically the Ukrainians will lose the only point of entrance on this foothold. Of course, they can use the forest, these fields, to cross this territory on feet, so using just infantry, but it's too risky and too dangerous, and the most important, too long. Anyway, there is no possibilities to evacuate soldiers using their feet crossing these fields. So now the main goal, the main purpose of the Ukrainians is to develop their logistic, and to be more precise, is to establish control and to create the second entrance point. And this is the second entrance point that Ukrainians are trying to develop. So if the Ukrainians, and currently the Ukrainians do have control over this entrance point, but they don't have control over the landing point on the Russian bank of the river. So they can send boats to this direction, they can enter this river, they can enter the islands, but there are no chances to bypass these islands safely and to get the landing area, because the bank of the river that located on the opposite side of this entrance is under Russian control, and when the Ukrainians, let's say, bypass this territory using the river, let's say if the Ukrainians continue movements to the south, they're getting here, then they're getting here, and somewhere at this point the Russians will destroy the Ukrainians with machine guns, with snipers, with mortars, with every type of weapon they have. So this is the reason why the Ukrainians, no matter the situation, no matter the losses, need to take control over this territory. And this is the reason why the Ukrainians continue their movements using infantry, using FPV drones to the southwest of the main landing position. So this is the main Ukrainian movements. And to confirm this, we have at least few geolocations from this territory. On this video, we will not complete this video. On this video, we see how the Ukrainians began this operation. There is Russian soldier, and the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russian positions with FPV drones. After that, the Ukrainians established control over this territory, and the Russians started bombing the Ukrainian forces in this area using mortars and so on. This video we could see the evacuation squad of the Ukrainians who got under artillery fire and basically was destroyed. But we are using this video at least for geolocation purposes. So this is the situation. And now the Russians understand one thing, that they need to cut supply roads. Yes, they can establish fire control over this territory, but the main problem is that currently the weather in this area is very bad. And we saw a lot of videos how the Ukrainians landed their infantry on the ground, and as you can see, there are fog in this area, and basically the Russians can't operate in this area using drones, reconnaissance drones, because they would not see anything. Furthermore, the Ukrainians can, let's say, make these landing operations during the night period of time, which will also reduce the Russian possibilities. So that's why the Russians understand that if they want to establish control over this area, they need to make one thing. Now, you know that the Russians changed their tactics. When Wagner was the main power, the main engine of Russian army, the Russians were using just the, let's say, the force, the power, the man force to make some operations. And now I say that the Russians try to use their brains, at least at this stage of operation, trying to find the shortest way how to solve this or that issue. And basically, if we take a look at this geolocation, we understand that there is one point that the Russians need to establish control over, and the entire foothold of the Ukrainian forces will be collapsed. And I'm talking about the first landing area, about this territory, because if the Russians can establish control and clear this territory, basically the Russians will be able to cut the main supply road, and after that the Ukrainians are no longer able to continue their landing operation further to the central landing area. And so this is going to be the collapse. Of course, it will take time until the Russians are able to clear the entire territory, to force the Ukrainians to step back from the islands. Maybe the Russians will not be able to force the Ukrainians to step back from the islands, but anyway, from day to day, from maybe months to months, sooner or later, maybe during the winter period of time, this area will be collapsed from the Ukrainian side. And this is the reason why the Russians launched an offensive operation today exactly in this direction. So basically from the northwest in the direction of the central part of Krynky and the southwestern part of Krynky. For those purposes, the Russians were using infantry, and on this video we can see how the Ukrainians managed to discover the Russian sabotage group or reconnaissance group that were trying to hide somewhere on the edge positions in Krynky. The Ukrainians managed to discover them, and after that the Ukrainians start bombing them with FPV drones. We will not watch this video because of casualties and losses and a lot of mass and a lot of blood and so on. Also, the Russians launched another offensive operation using tanks. That was something like reconnaissance in force. 2 tanks almost entered the central part of Krynky, trying to attack the Ukrainians and trying to discover the situation, and the most important, trying to discover whether the Ukrainians have anti-tank missiles. And as a result of that small reconnaissance, the Russians, as I understand, managed to get everything they need, and they turned back and started moving back. At some point, one of the Russian tank was damaged, or maybe the tank was broken or something like this, and as a result of FPV drone strikes, that tank was probably destroyed by the Ukrainians. So basically, the Russians abandoned the tank and left this territory. So the Russians started attacking this area. Also, the Ukrainians understand clearly that they're in a very critical situation, because one more time, if the Russians are able to take control over this part of Krynky, the entire bridgehead will be collapsed automatically. So this is the situation in this area. But, and of course we can say that we may ask ourselves whether the Ukrainians have chances to hold this area or not. According to the Western redeployments map, we have some updates, and according to information we have, the Ukrainians have redeployed the 137th Marine Battalion of 35th Marine Brigade. So this update you can find on any Western deployment map. But this is not the final update. The most important thing, that official Telegram channel of that 35th Marine Brigade published information about the critical situation of their forces on the Russian bank of the river. Furthermore, they're saying not just about the losses, about the absence of supply. The most important piece of information that the Ukrainians are saying, that there is a traitor in their ranks, in their brigade, who always provide the Russians information about exact positions of Ukrainian forces, of Ukrainians 35th Brigade forces on this bank of the river. And the sources from that brigade, from official channel, require the Ukrainian authorities to start official investigation and to find a rat and to find a traitor. So the situation is critical, and many things are telling me, at least, that during the next few weeks there are very high chances that the Russians will completely clear this territory and the Ukrainians will receive another defeat on Kherson direction. When talking about other updates, of course, one of the most interesting videos we got from Achakov. The Russians published the video of another Lancet strike. On this video we see as that the Russians managed to discover a radar in the vicinity of Achakov, and as a result of Lancet strike, that radar was destroyed. Of course, Lancet is a perfect weapon. It's like a discovered weapon of the special military operation. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians are increasing production of all types of drones, including Geran drones, Shahed drones, and many Lancet drones. For example, according to Ukrainian calculations, the Russians are producing around 200 drones per month. 200 drones per month of Geran. The Ukrainians haven't provided us any numbers regarding the production of Lancet, but as I understand, the Russians have almost the same possibilities to build from 100 till 200 Lancet per month. Significant number, obviously. Now we're moving to Energodar direction, and we got another geolocated video of the usage of Lancet. On this video we can see how the Ukrainians were moving their air defense system somewhere in the fields to take it fighting position, but the Russians, using Orlan-10 probably drone, discovered the movement of Ukrainian air defense system, and as a result of Lancet strike, that system was destroyed. So as you can see, the Russians were flying in a very deep rear of Ukrainian forces, and the Ukrainians have no possibility, have no chances to do anything with this. Now we're moving to Zaporizhzhia direction, and we got more bad piece of news from the Ukrainian side. If you remember, a few days ago we got an update that the Russians made a very powerful strike against the Ukrainian forces in the village by the name of Zaporizhzhia, and according to information we have, the Russians managed to discover and destroy the officers and the most experienced forces of 128th Mountain Assault Brigade. That update took place on the 5th of November, and today the Russian forces published another piece of news, and as a result of a new strike that took place also these days, like maybe today, maybe yesterday, as a result of that attack, another Ukrainian brigade, Spartan, was under very heavy fire, and the Ukrainians had significant losses. Currently we don't have any numbers regarding the losses, but as I understand, if the strike was successful, obviously tomorrow the Russians will provide us video confirmations, and probably this update will be included into the Ministry of Defense report. And this is very important important to update. So basically, during the 2 previous weeks, during the previous 10 days, the Russians managed to cut off the head of the most experienced forces of 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, and the second brigade that was cut off is the 3rd Operational Brigade Spartan National Guard. Basically, these, according to this map, the Spartan is located in Orekhov, but we need to understand that these front lines, some battalions are located here, some located there, but both these 2 brigades, the main area of responsibility of these 2 brigades is the city or the village by the name of Petykhatki. So during the previous 10 days, the Russians cut off the head of those experienced brigades and launched their own greatest offensive operation in this direction. And during the previous few days, we received significant number of geolocations of videos how the Russians were bombing and attacking this village with all types of the Russians have, like aviation bombardments, like gated bombs, like multi-launch rocket systems, TOSed flamethrowers. Furthermore, we got some updates that the Russians managed to enter the village. We had some videos of Ukrainian losses, how the Ukrainians were trying to repel. So what I'm trying to say, that probably all these events are connected. The Russians first demoralized the forces of of those forces who are responsible for this area, and now the Russians launched few waves of attacks. Furthermore, some sources are saying that as a result of another reconnaissance in force, the Russians managed to establish control over these 3 lines and to get as close as possible to the village itself. So as I understand, within the next few days, probably there are very high chances that the Russians will start a landing operation in the village, and they will try to return control over this territory and to force the Ukrainians to step back further to the north in direction of Lapkova and Stepova. And this is another episode of the Russian attempt to reduce till zero the Ukrainian progress during the Ukrainian greatest counteroffensive operation that started on the 4th of June. Now we're moving to Zaporizhzhia direction. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 40 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system. During the previous night, the Russians were hunting and attacking the abandoned Ukrainian equipment, armored vehicles. The Russians were attacking and trying to destroy the Ukrainian supply machines, evacuation cars, just one more time, abandoned tanks and armored vehicles. But the Ukrainians from their side continued their attempts to develop their positions in the foothold on the west and the west-north of Verbova. As a result of those clashes, the Ukrainians probably managed to establish control over a few more trenches and 3 lines. The Russians published their own video how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainians on this territory, which basically confirms the Ukrainian progress on this direction. The progress is not so big, but anyway, this is the progress. Now we're moving further to Avdiivka tactical bridgehead, where we have another Lancet strike. As a result of that attack, another Ukrainian positions were damaged or destroyed in the vicinity of Novomykhailivka. So, and when talking about the common situation, as a result of clashes on the South Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost 140 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and 5 artillery systems. The main clashes and the main activity we can see in the vicinity of Staromaiorske and Urozhaina. The Russians started something like artillery preparation, of course, and something like FPV drone preparation of this territory before the next offensive operation. So this is the pattern. 30, 20, maybe 10 years ago, and during the Second World War, the first stage was artillery preparation. Now in the modern warfare, in the special military operation, added another episode, another phase of any offensive operation. And first of all, this is FPV drone preparation, then artillery preparation, and maybe then we can see the real assault or ground and operation on the ground. So if you remember, during the previous weeks, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of Priutina. Basically, they managed to secure the flanks, and now there are no problems for further offensive operation, and we need to expect that there are very high chances that the upcoming week the Russians will launch a series of attacks in direction of Staromaiorske. When talking about South Donetsk direction, we got just few geolocations. The Russians haven't shown us any activity on the south or on the north of Novomykhailivka. There were no Russian activity in the vicinity of Soledar. We have the photo of the bridge that located between Konstantinovka and Marinka. As you can see, the bridge was damaged, but still the Ukrainians, as I understand, can use this bridge using light vehicles or something like this. Novomykhailivka is under very heavy fire as usually, but the Russians still haven't launched the ground operation in the village because the territory around the village is heavily mined, and currently the Russians don't have chances to break and penetrate very big distances because they will go to minefields and will be destroyed. Now we're moving to Donetsk direction, and we have lots of updates from this territory. We have few more Lancet strikes in the vicinity of Ocheretina, the main logistic hub that Ukrainians use for redeployment of their forces. On this video we see how the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian artillery position as a result of Lancet strike. That artillery system was destroyed. Furthermore, the Ukrainian sources published the video in Ocheretina near the railways. As you can see, there is a very heavy fire, maybe the results of explosion. Anyway, the Ukrainians, as we discussed, use this area as the main logistic hub, and the Russians are saying that as a result of some strike, the Russians managed to destroy the Ukrainian fuel depot. So we see that the Russians continue their offensive operation, and they continue the tightening process of Avdiivka news. What about the situation on the ground? We have video from Ukrainian side on the west of Krasnogorovka. On this video we can see we are watching this video because just to see like an episode of the special military operation. So what we see, this video was geolocated along the tree lines. We have significant number of Russian forces that were trying to hide among the tree lines, and most of them, the Russians, took a defense like state because they heard with their ears the sound of FPV drone, and we see like burned and damaged armored vehicle. And the thing is that this soldier was walking around mines, so all the things in the area of his legs is probably dozens of anti-tank or anti-infantry mines that the Russians probably were collecting, were demining, or they were doing some security and clearing process or something like this. But at some point the Ukrainians intelligence discovered this area, and the Ukrainians took a decision to use this chance, and they attacked the Russians with the FPV drone, and there was a very heavy explosion. Basically, we will not watch the second part of this video, but as a result of the strike and that explosion, every single Russian who was in the vicinity of this area was wounded or even killed because of like that parts of the mines were flying in very long distances. So the situation in this area continues develops. The Russians continue the storming process of Stepova. Currently, the clashes are taking place in the central part. The Ukrainians still send more and more reinforcements. The Russians are doing the same. As I understand, very soon, maybe this week, we are going to see the final point in the battle, and the Russians will be able to continue their offensive further in direction of Berdachi, and the clashes will start taking place exactly in this small village on the west of Stepova. The Russians continue advancing on the south in the vicinity of industrial area. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to establish control over a few more square kilometers in this area, and they're getting closer and closer. And at the beginning of this operation, the Russians were controlling just 30% of this territory, and now the Russians control around 70%. The Ukrainians don't have chances to counterattack, to hold this territory, and the main reason of that is complete absence of any artillery support, because these edge positions are located too far from the main Ukrainian artillery positions, and basically the Ukrainians are not going to risk with their Western weapon, with even Ukrainian weapon, with artillery rounds. And as I understand, the destiny, at least of this part of Avdiivka, has been already determined by the Russians and the Ukrainians, and this is going to be the first area that will be cleared and liberated, whatever, by the Russian side. The Russians continue bombardments of Avdiivka with the FAB 500 with different types of weapons, so the Avdiivka offensive operation continues. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes on this direction, the Ukrainians lost 220 soldiers, 8 armored vehicles, including 1 tank, and 5 artillery systems. Very interesting updates are coming from the line between Toretsk-Gorlovka. Probably for the first time since the beginning of the special military operation, we start receiving something from this area. And we got at least 3 different updates from 3 different sources, and according to information we have, the Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive operation on this direction. And as a result of clashes, the Ukrainians were using the small village by the name of Shumy as the main foothold. The Ukrainians, maybe during the Russian rotation process or whatever, launched attack, and as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians managed to establish control over the Terikon, over the landfill that used to be under Russian control. So that was an unexpected attack, and the Russians were forced to step back. Probably when the Russians withdrew their positions and, let's say, returned in Gorlovka, they analyzed the entire situation and understood that they can't allow the Ukrainians to dig in deeper in the landfill. So that's why the Russians launched a counteroffensive operation. How did that happen? First of all, the Ukrainians used significant number of forces, and most of the forces were moved from Shumy to Terikon for assault purposes. And the main concentration of Ukrainian forces were in this area. The Russians calculated the numbers. They took a decision that currently Shumy is not protected, and the Russians launched a counter-offensive operation in this village, basically trying not just to establish control over this village, but also to encircle the Ukrainian forces who captured and cleared the Terikon. So the battle was very heavy, the clash is still very heavy, and it's really a real unknown what is going on there, but I've just tried to explain to you what probably happened in this direction. One more time, the Ukrainians collected forces, made an unexpected attack and captured Terikon. The Russians retreated and attacked their main base in Shumy, trying to cut the Ukrainian forces in Terikon off from the mainland and basically to encircle them. So tomorrow we'll see whether that was an epic fail of the Russian forces because they lost a very important stronghold in the face of this landfill, or the Russians tricked the Ukrainians and they counterattack when the Ukrainians didn't expect that the Russians could do this. So very interesting situation. We will follow this, because if the Russians can establish control over this area like Shumy and Terikon, basically with this progress the Russians managed to, without almost losses, managed to penetrate the first and the most important defense belt, and basically the Russians have opened for themselves the gates to enter the New York Donetsk agglomeration. So this might be like a significant victory for the Russians, by the way. Now we are moving to Bakhmut, Artyomovsk direction. We got also a lot of geolocation from this territory, and the most important are coming from the railways between Artyomovsk and Avdiivka. Somehow I missed that update, but according to at least geolocations we received today, somehow as a result of clashes during the previous weeks, the Ukrainians managed to establish control over this territory as well. I don't remember any geolocations from this territory, but the Russians today launched at least a series of counterattacks using armored vehicles and tanks to return positions and to force the Ukrainians to step back from the Russian side of the railways. Currently, it's unknown whether the Russians were able to achieve this and to force the Ukrainians to step back. The only thing we have is the Russian counterattack. And the only thing that we need to add that there were no, during this video was provided by the Ukrainians, and we don't see the a significant number of destroyed Russian tanks, of blow-ups, of parts and so on, just the episode of counterattack. So there are very high chances that the Russians managed to force the Ukrainians to step back. As I understand, we're going to receive the real updates about the situation in this area maybe tomorrow or the day after. When talking about the global scope of Bakhmut operation, the Russians currently are making some operational pause, regrouping before further next of attack. The Ukrainians understand the difficultness of the situation, and so that's why the Ukrainians activated or increased their activity on the Soledar direction. So you see, it's like checkmates. For example, the Russians launched attack in Avdiivka. The Ukrainians need to take reserves from Bakhmut to Avdiivka. The Russians launched attack in Bakhmut to freeze the Ukrainians' reserves. The Russians launched attack in Bogdanovka, and the Ukrainians have some problems with manpower in this direction, so that's why they are launching their attacks of 30th Mechanized Brigade on Soledar direction with the purpose to force the Russians from Berkhovka water reservoir to redeploy some reserves from this area to the north. So the Ukrainians also try to play with reserves, with forces, and so they try to force the Russians to step back and return to the north. So everything is very complicated, and now we are getting the stage when sooner or later either the Russians or the Ukrainians will make a mistake. So this is the period of time of mistake. Anyway, somebody is going to make a mistake. Currently, both the Russians and either the Russians and the Ukrainians are operating on the combat lines without mistakes. So because they have reserves. So if they see that there might be a mistake, they're sending reserve there. But at some point, there are going to be a situation when there are going to be no reserves to cover and to protect this or that territory. And exactly at this moment, the most important and interesting part of the special military operation is going to start. And because of such heavy intensifying of actions right now, I understand that this moment is getting closer and closer every second and every minute. When talking about Kupyansk and Lyman front line, we haven't received anything from Lyman. The only thing we have is the report of Minister of Defense, and as a result of clashes on Lyman front line, we got another day of heaviest losses from the Ukrainian side, 180 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems, but there are almost nothing to that we can show you, nothing to geolocate, and so very difficult to understand. And we got a lot of updates from Kupyansk direction. The Russians published another video footage of another bridge over Oskol River. The Ukrainians probably managed to restore this bridge one more time to have at least some support of Ukrainian forces on the Russian bank of Oskol River, but the Russians, as soon as the Ukrainians restored the bridge, destroyed the bridge one more time. And also the Russians published the final confirmation of complete absence of the bridge in this area, and that Ukrainians are no longer planning to restore any communication between Oskol rivers, because they understand it's just a waste of time. So as I understand, the situation for the Ukrainians on Kupyansk direction is getting worse and worse as well. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.